The city of Guanajuato, known for its colonial architecture and winding streets, never imagined that someone from its small population would become the center of a silent war fought in the shadows of drug trafficking. Miguel Martinez was an ordinary man, or at least he seemed to be. Born and raised in the city, he spent his days working in a mechanic's shop, repairing old cars and taking care of his father's store. Life wasn't easy, but he was content. However, Miguel's destiny was about to change, and it wouldn't be by his own choice. The Jalisco Cartel, one of Mexico's most powerful and ruthless criminal organizations, had eyes and ears everywhere. It wasn't a question of if you'd be noticed, but when. Miguel, at 32 years old, was an ordinary man with a rare skill. He was a talented mechanic with an almost magical instinct for repairing equipment and engines. This might seem trivial, but for the cartel, this talent could be a valuable asset. More precisely, Miguel had a knack for rebuilding and optimizing armored cars, transport vehicles, and even the cars used to transport drugs and weapons. On that sweltering summer afternoon, as the sun beat down on the city hills, Miguel had no idea that his life would become the target of a dangerous interest. He was working on an engine when the workshop door opened, and without warning a tall man entered, dressed in dark clothes and sunglasses, despite the heat. His presence was unmistakable, and the tension in the air seemed palpable. "Are you Miguel Martinez?" the man asked in a calm but firm voice that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. Miguel looked up, slightly surprised by the sudden visit. It wasn't common for customers from out of town to show up at the workshop, much less someone so imposing. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The man took off his sunglasses and looked around as if checking to see if they were being watched. "I'm Javier. I work for the Jalisco Cartel. We're interested in you." Those words landed like a bomb. Miguel didn't know whether to laugh or run. The cartel? The dreaded Jalisco Cartel, which dominated so many regions of Mexico. There was no way to be serious. But the expression on the man's face left no room for doubt. He was there for a very specific reason. "You have skills that we need. Repairing, modifying, and armoring cars efficiently and discreetly. You could be useful to our operation." Miguel felt the weight of the veiled threat. He knew what happened to those who refused to collaborate with organizations like that one. Those who opposed them didn't simply disappear, they were deleted just like that. Javier observed Miguel with an enigmatic smile. He didn't need to say anything more. It was already clear what was being offered or demanded. The cartel wanted control. He wanted to use his skills to expand his operations. It would be a choice between submitting to them or becoming a victim. But what Javier didn't know was that Miguel wasn't the type of man who would be easily intimidated. Miguel thought for a moment. He knew what was at stake. He knew that if he refused, his life would hang by a thread. But something inside him, a strength he didn't even know he possessed, compelled him to make a bold decision. He wasn't going to be just another pawn in the cartel's game. "I don't work for anyone," Miguel replied, in a firm tone that surprised even Javier. "You can take your invitation back." Javier's reaction was swift. He hadn't expected such a direct, bold response. The cartel was far too powerful to be challenged by a simple, small-town mechanic. But something in Miguel's posture, the gleam in his eyes, the look of someone ready to face danger, made Javier hesitate for a brief moment. The smile on his face vanished. "You don't know what you're doing," Javier said with a menacing calm. "This isn't a proposal, Miguel. It's a order." Before leaving, he cast one last glance at the mechanic, as if assessing his resilience. "Let's see if your courage will hold up when the cartel comes after you. We'll see each other again." Miguel stood still, watching the door close behind Javier. The weight of the threat hung in the air, but something burned inside him. He knew that this was the worst decision what the cartel could have done. It wasn't just about him or his skill with engines. It was about who he was, and he wasn't going to surrender so easily. The city of Guanajuato, famous for its silver mining and rich cultural heritage dating back to the colonial period, has always enjoyed a certain tranquility, far from the spotlight of violence that consumed many parts of the country. For Miguel, that place was synonymous with a simple and honest life, far from the major urban conflicts. He lived in a modest house, inherited from his parents, and his routine consisted of tending to the mechanic shop that his father, José Martinez, had opened more than 30 years ago. The two shared the same love for work and the same desire to keep the family together, away from bigger problems. José had always been a reserved man, of few words, but with a quiet wisdom that came from the experience of someone who had lived for many years in a region marked by poverty and violence. He knew that in Mexico, many young people like Miguel were lured into joining criminal factions, and so he always tried to teach him the values of honesty and perseverance. However, the reality was not so simple. Miguel grew up witnessing the transformations in the neighboring cities. The shadow of drug trafficking and criminal organizations grew larger each year, causing the once peaceful small towns to be gradually invaded by cartels seeking to expand their reach. Stories of violence, extortion, and corruption were no longer confined to the large metropolises. They arrived in Guanajuato like an unstoppable steamroller. But for Miguel, until that moment, these were just stories. Until the moment when Jalisco Cartel, he appeared at his door. Javier's visit left Miguel with more questions than answers. He knew the risk he was taking by challenging such a vast and influential cartel, but there was something else inside him that compelled him to resist. Perhaps it was his family's pride, loyalty to his father's memory, or even an internal rebellion against the fate that seemed to have been imposed upon him. The cartel wasn't a distant threat. They were right there, among them, and that changed everything. But while Miguel dealt with the consequences of his refusal, the Jalisco Cartel also faced its own challenges. The organization was a well-oiled machine, but its members, including Javier, were not invulnerable. Javier was one of many who had been shaped by the cartel's ruthless system, where loyalty was bought with power and money. But, like all men who belonged to such organizations, Javier also had a past that haunted him. He wasn't just an envoy for the cartel. He had been a young man from a small town like Miguel before being recruited. His transformation into one of the cartel's most feared men wasn't by choice. Like many, he had been forced into crime, seduced by power, the promise of a life of unrestricted wealth, far from the poverty his family faced. Javier was now in the cartel's service, and his mission was clear: recruit new members, especially those with rare skills like Miguel. What Javier didn't know was that his presence in Guanajuato had been a mistake. He underestimated Miguel. He thought that his mere position of power and the threat of the cartel would be enough to make the mechanic bow to their will. But Miguel was more than just a simple mechanic. He had in his blood the determination of a man who would refuse to be submissive, even in the face of everything the cartel could do. Miguel didn't know how, but he knew that the Jalisco Cartel, he wasn't going to give up so easily. They weren't known for backing down in the face of initial resistance. But he also knew that his refusal to yield had triggered something more, a chain reaction. The cartel, until then, may have seen him as just a pawn on the board, but now he had become something more dangerous, enemy to be eliminated or transformed into an ally. That night, upon returning home, Miguel sat at the dinner table with his mother, Teresa, a woman who had always tried to protect her son from the harshness of the outside world. She had sensed that something was wrong, but Miguel, ever cautious, tried to hide his apprehension. The last thing he wanted was to worry her. However, she knew. Mothers always know. "You know who it was, don't you?" Teresa asked, her eyes fixed on the plate, but her voice heavy with a premonition. Miguel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, Mom. I know who they are. The cartel is after me." She wasn't surprised, but the fear on her face was clear. The only thing she ever wanted was to protect her son from all of this. Miguel knew that in his city, the cartel's violence was no longer a distant threat. It was a palpable reality. Miguel's refusal to submit to the Jalisco Cartel not only put him in the organization's crosshairs, but also distanced him from any possibility of returning to his former life. The peace of Guanajuato, which until then seemed untouched by the ills of crime, began to crumble little by little. The city began to feel the presence of the cartel, an invisible but omnipresent force that began to infiltrate even the smallest shops and the humblest families. In the following days, Miguel tried to maintain normalcy in his workshop, but he knew he was being watched. Strange cars began to park in front of his house, and men with fixed gazes constantly passed by on the street, observing from afar. Fear spread like wildfire. Even his father, José, felt the pressure. The old mechanic didn't say anything at first, but the worry in his eyes was clear. He knew his simple, honest life was at risk. But reality soon set in. A month after meeting Javier, Miguel found a message on the hood of his car, a simple folded sheet of paper with a phrase that made his heart race. "You have nowhere to run." The letter was signed with a symbol, the logo of the Jalisco Cartel. That wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. They were starting to show their true colors. However, Miguel was not an easy man to defeat. He knew he couldn't escape. He was no longer in a position to flee. His refusal had already altered the course of events, and now he had no choice. It was fight or be swallowed up. But how could he fight against a power as vast and ruthless as the cartel? That's when he started to remember something, his father's past. José never talked much about his youth, but there was something mysterious about his story. Miguel had always known that his father had been involved in something before opening the workshop, something related to fighting the cartels, but he never knew the details. There was always a shadow on José's face when the subject came up. Now, with his life in danger, Miguel knew he needed to uncover that secret. That night, after his shift, Miguel approached his father as he cleaned his tools in the workshop. He knew there was no more room for evasions. It was time to know the truth. "Dad, I need to know. What do you know about the cartels? What did you do when you were younger?" José looked up, surprised but not indignant. He put the tool aside and took a deep breath, as if he were finally preparing to tell something he had been keeping to himself for years. "I was part of a resistance group. It was small, nothing like what you imagine. We fought against the cartels, trying to protect our community, but we were few, and we were defeated." The old mechanic looked at his son, his eyes welling with tears. "I was your age, Miguel, and just like you, I also thought I could make a difference." Miguel was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. He had grown up with the idea that his father was just an ordinary man, someone who wanted a quiet life. Now he understood that the man who had always taught him about honesty and hard work had been a hero of a lost war. "They haven't disappeared, Miguel," José continued with a look of sorrow. "The cartels aren't like other enemies. They don't let themselves be defeated easily. They disguise themselves, infiltrate, and continue to grow. But if you're determined to keep going, there's something I can give you." José stood up and went to a shelf in the corner of the workshop. From there, he took out a small metal box and handed it to Miguel. Inside the box were special tools, which Miguel immediately recognized. They weren't ordinary mechanics' tools, but sophisticated devices, modifications made for cars and weaponry. His father had worked with advanced technology for the government, an area he had kept secret until now. "These tools were made for you. I taught you to be a mechanic, but you always had something more, Miguel. If you're going to fight, you're going to need this. I can't protect you, but you can make a difference." The shock of the revelation was immense, but it also brought a clarity that Miguel hadn't had before. He now had something he could use against the cartel, and with that, he would have to act fast. He knew the cartel wouldn't give him much time to prepare. They would come after him, and this time it wouldn't just be a threat but a hunt. The following morning, upon opening the workshop, Miguel encountered an even more disturbing surprise. His old friend, Andres, a former soldier with whom he had served in the army, was waiting for him. Andres was in a difficult situation, for, like Miguel, he had made powerful enemies, and now he was offering his help. "I know what happened, Miguel. The Jalisco Cartel won't stop until they get you, but I won't let them destroy you." Andres smiled, with a confidence Miguel hadn't seen in years. "I have some connections that can help you. Let's get ready." Together, Miguel and Andres formed an unlikely alliance, a resistance team that began to unite with a single objective: to destroy the Jalisco Cartel, not with brute force, but with cunning and intelligence. The alliance between Miguel and Andres seemed to be the only chance of survival for both of them. But, as always happens in war stories, sacrifices and difficult choices soon began to take their toll. The pressure Miguel felt didn't just come from the cartel. His own community was becoming a minefield, and he was beginning to realize that, in Mexico, no one was completely free from the reach of criminal organizations. The cartel's men began to infiltrate the city more aggressively. One by one, small business owners and local leaders began to be threatened or bribed. The line between friends and enemies became increasingly blurred. Those whom Miguel knew and trusted now seemed to be making decisions he never imagined. Even his own customers at the workshop, who had previously greeted him with a smile, were afraid to look him in the eye. On a tense morning, Miguel received an unexpected visit. His mother, Teresa, was waiting in the workshop with a worried expression. She had noticed that Miguel was no longer sleeping at home, and that the city was being gripped by an oppressive atmosphere of fear. And, as always, she was unwilling to accept passivity. "Miguel, you need to stop this. What you're doing won't end well. I'd rather you run away with Andres, live your life, than see my son die for a cause that has no salvation." Miguel felt a lump in his throat. He knew his mother was right, but his blood boiled at the thought that his struggle was futile. He wanted a chance. But more than that, he wanted to show that he wasn't just a mechanic, that his life wouldn't be controlled by forces he didn't understand. "I can't do this, Mom. Not after everything the cartel has done. Not after my decision. They won't leave me alone, and I can't let them destroy everything I know. I won't run away." She looked at him, tears in her eyes, but she understood. Miguel's determination reflected something she could no longer dispute, something she already knew all too well in her own blood. While Miguel struggled with family and personal dilemmas, the Jalisco Cartel was preparing to take even more drastic action. Javier, the man who had started this whole affair by trying to recruit Miguel, began to show a darker, more calculating side. The cartel knew that Miguel had been challenged, and the only way to deal with a challenge was to crush it before it became a real threat. Javier, with his own ambitions, couldn't allow someone like Miguel to become a symbol of resistance. He had a meticulous plan to ensure Miguel was taken out of the game, and he knew the best way to do that was to mess with the mechanic's feelings and relationships. It was time to press where it hurt most in Miguel's personal life. He approached Teresa, knowing she was the only person who could influence Miguel's decisions. Javier, ever relentless, made the same threat he had made before, but with renewed intensity. "Miguel can't escape, Teresa. He has already chosen his fate. Now, we have to see how far this courage will go. We don't want to hurt him, but if he doesn't give in, you and everyone he loves will be at risk." Teresa, already weakened by the psychological pressure, was torn between terror and the desire to protect her son. She knew that the only way to try to save Miguel would be to do what was most difficult, convince Miguel to give up the resistance. But deep down, she knew he wouldn't surrender. A mother's pain was more than enough to crush any desire to escape, but she found herself in an internal battle, wishing to find a way for everyone to get out alive. Meanwhile, Miguel, with Andrés' support, was hatching his own plans. They had managed to obtain crucial information about the cartel's movements, using Andrés' contacts in the criminal underworld and the connections his father had left behind. They were beginning to assemble a small resistance army, people who, like them, had something to lose and were willing to fight against the cartel's oppression. Tension was rising. The city seemed to be in constant anticipation of something catastrophic, but no one knew what it would be. The cartel wouldn't hesitate to make a risky move to crush any resistance, and the battle that was about to happen wasn't just about who would win, but about what would be destroyed along the way. Miguel knew that if he wanted to protect his city, he would have to make greater sacrifices than he ever imagined. His fight was only beginning, and he didn't yet know the price he would have to pay. Tensions in Guanajuato were at their peak. The once tranquil streets now reflected the constant fear that hung over the city. Miguel, Andrés, and their allies were preparing for an inevitable confrontation with the Jalisco Cartel, and the moment of clash seemed imminent. What began as a fight for survival was transforming into something much bigger, a fight for justice, for dignity, and above all, for the soul of their city. That night the sky was clear, but a frigid wind blew across the hills. Miguel was in his workshop with Andrés, finalizing the details of their plan. They were ready to act. The time had come to attack the Jalisco Cartel, but doubt still lingered in Miguel's mind. He didn't know if he was truly prepared for what was to come. He knew that the only way to defeat the cartel was through intelligence and courage, not brute force. That's when the news arrived. Miguel was in the middle of a conversation with Andrés about upcoming actions when one of his most trusted contacts, Juan, rushed through the workshop door. He was pale, breathless, and had the look of someone who had seen the impossible. "Miguel, you have to hear this," Juan said, almost breathless. "They just took your mother. She's with them." Miguel froze. The world seemed to spin for a moment, and he felt the pressure of a ton crushing his chest. Teresa, his mother. They had taken her. The cartel, knowing that the best way to get to Miguel would be to strike him where he loved most, had kidnapped her. Andrés was the first to react, standing up quickly. "We're going after her. We can't waste any time." Miguel didn't answer immediately. His brain was racing, trying to understand how the cartel had acted so quickly and what they hoped to achieve with that move. They wanted him to surrender. They wanted him to give up the fight and turn himself in, or else his mother would pay the price. But something inside Miguel, a force he didn't yet fully understand, ignited. It wasn't just about his mother, it was about what she represented. She was the last connection to his childhood, to everything he had wanted to be before the world became so dark. Now, Miguel had no choice. The cartel had invaded his world, and he wasn't going to let them destroy everything. "We're going to rescue her," Miguel said with a determination that surprised even Andrés. "But we're going to do it our way. No running into the lion's den without a plan." The revelation of Teresa's kidnapping was not just an attempt by the cartel to break Miguel, but also a strategic move. Javier, the man who had tried to recruit Miguel, was behind it all. He knew that to defeat a man like Miguel, he needed to attack his roots. He was testing Miguel's courage and placing him in an impossible dilemma: succumb to fear and his own weaknesses, or face his greatest fears and move forward. Meanwhile, Teresa was being held by cartel men in an isolated location far from the city. She was tied to a chair in an old barn, in the middle of an abandoned property, and watched the man in charge of the operation, a cold and calculating individual known as the Wolf. He knew that his role was not only to hold Teresa back, but to weaken Miguel emotionally, to force him to make a choice that would prevent him from moving on. El Lobo, a man of few words and silent cruelty, watched the woman who was the key to achieving his goal. "He'll come after you. If you don't give in now, he'll regret it." But Teresa, even bound and vulnerable, was not a woman who gave up easily. She knew the son she had raised. She knew Miguel would never surrender, and she also knew the cartel was making a fatal mistake by underestimating him. She had faith in her son, even in the midst of her worst nightmare. "Miguel won't give in. He will defeat you. You will never win." El Lobo merely smiled, but it wasn't a smile of confidence. He knew Miguel was approaching. Something inside him sensed that this young mechanic wasn't as easily broken as he'd imagined. As Teresa's rescue drew closer, Miguel made a decision. He would use the cartel itself against them. He knew that if he simply raided Teresa's hideout, they would be ready for a direct confrontation. But Miguel had something else in mind. He would use intelligence, cunning, and whatever else he had at his disposal. With Andrés, he orchestrated a daring plan. They had the right contacts, the necessary information, and most importantly, the determination to take the Jalisco Cartel to its own game. It wouldn't just be a life-or-death fight. It would be the final surprise, something no one expected. Miguel and Andrés's plan began to be put into action immediately after the revelation of Teresa's kidnapping. Every move was calculated, every step planned, with a precision that only desperation could inspire. Teresa's life was now in the cartel's hands, but Miguel wouldn't allow that to be the end of his story. He knew that every passing second brought him closer to an irreversible confrontation, but the pain and despair he felt were transformed into action. The pressure was unbearable, but that was precisely what made him stronger. The cartel hadn't just made a mistake by kidnapping Teresa. They had underestimated Miguel's ability to act under pressure, and this was becoming clear to everyone involved. Javier, who believed that the fear of losing his mother would make Miguel back down, was now beginning to realize that he had played the wrong person. Miguel's presence in the war against the cartel was no longer a simple resistance, but a strategic offensive move. While Miguel and Andrés finalized the details of the plan, the city of Guanajuato began to feel the first repercussions of the offensive. Rumors that Miguel was ready to act spread like wildfire. Some people, fearing reprisals, began to leave their homes, seeking refuge in more remote areas. Others, however, began to see Miguel as a beacon of hope, someone who had finally stood up against the invisible giants that controlled the country. The city, once dominated by fear and passivity, now pulsed with a different energy, a small resistance movement beginning to take shape. In the hideout where Teresa was being held, El Lobo and his men were beginning to realize that the situation wouldn't be so simple. The cartel had underestimated Miguel, but they had also underestimated the loyalty of those around him. They thought that by kidnapping Teresa, they could force Miguel to surrender. What they didn't know was that this had only ignited the flame of his determination. As El Lobo gazed at the woman at his mercy, he didn't know how close he was to the end. "Do you really think he's going to come after you? Did you think your death would be enough to make him surrender?" Teresa asked, with a calmness that surprised even El Lobo. He laughed, but the laugh lacked the confidence it once had. "He has no choice. Everyone has a price, Teresa, even him." While the cartel prepared its reaction, Miguel and Andrés were on their way to the location where Teresa was being held. They knew they couldn't attack directly in a conventional way. To achieve their objective, they needed to use guerrilla tactics, exploiting the cartel's weaknesses. The plan involved not only rescuing Teresa, but also destroying the cartel's operations in the region, weakening the organization's power once and for all. They knew time was against them. Every move Miguel made was being monitored, and the cartel's reactions intensified as the operation drew closer. Javier himself, now nervous, decided to place more men at the location where Teresa was being held, anticipating more aggressive action from Miguel. He no longer wanted to underestimate him. The tension between Miguel and the cartel men, especially Javier and El Lobo, began to intensify even further. It was a silent war, where each tried to predict the other's next move. Javier, who had been responsible for trying to recruit Miguel, now realized that he had created an unbeatable enemy, someone who would not bow down to threats or violence. On the eve of the attack, Miguel and Andres were prepared for the worst. They knew that any mistake could mean Teresa's death and the end of the resistance in Guanajuato. But at the same time, the trust they had in each other and the clarity of their objectives gave them the strength to move forward. When Miguel finally approached the hideout, the sound of a helicopter flying overhead was the last thing he expected. He and Andres exchanged glances, a sign that the operation had been compromised. The cartel was already aware of his approach. Without hesitation, Miguel made a radical decision. He knew that if he wanted to save his mother and at the same time destroy the cartel, he would need to deliver a fatal blow, a blow that would shake the entire structure of the organization. Andres looked at him, the same look of complicity and trust that had been present from the beginning. "We're not just going to rescue your mother. We're going to finish them off once and for all." Time had run out. Miguel and his allies knew the final confrontation could not be postponed. Those who opposed him would be crushed. However, the price would be high, and he could not back down. The fight was about to intensify in a way that neither he nor the cartel men were prepared to face. Miguel knew that confronting the cartel was a matter of life or death, but as events unfolded, he also understood that this conflict would not only be an external battle, it would also be an internal struggle. The weight of the decisions, the responsibility for the lives at stake, and above all, the burden of facing his own fear of losing everything, forced him to transform. He was no longer the young mechanic who simply wanted to lead a simple life. Miguel was becoming something greater, not only for his city, but for his own soul. As the cartel's helicopter flew overhead, Miguel felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with something deeper. It was fear, undoubtedly, but also something he had never felt so clearly. The need to act, to take control of his destiny, to be a man of action. His life was intertwined with the fight he had decided to face, and he no longer had room for doubt. Andres, his loyal friend, looked at Miguel before they set off for the battlefield. "You know what's at stake, Miguel. If we don't do this right, we'll lose everything. Not only will you lose your mother, but your city, the only thing you truly have." Miguel nodded, feeling a weight on his chest. The responsibility was overwhelming, but he couldn't back down. What had previously seemed like a fight for survival had now become a fight for dignity and the future of his city. He knew that the cartels, with their ruthless force, could never be defeated by a simple revolt, but Miguel had something they lacked, the will to fight for something bigger than himself. They arrived at the place where Teresa was being held prisoner. The place was an isolated barn, surrounded by tall trees and a vast open field. The shadows stretched out, and night seemed to have fallen more quickly than usual, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Miguel and Andres hid in the vegetation surrounding the barn, carefully observing the movements of the cartel men. They were prepared, but they knew this would not be a simple confrontation. The cartel had the numerical advantage and firepower. They needed to be quick, efficient, and above all, smart. As they prepared to go inside, Miguel had a moment of reflection. He thought of his mother, of everything she meant to him. She wasn't just his mother, she was the reason he was who he was. The woman who had shaped him, who had always taught him that, no matter how hard life got, one should never bow one's head in the face of injustice. With a steady gaze, Miguel looked at Andres. "We're ready for this. We're not going to run anymore. We're going to do what's right." The sound of gunfire in the distance broke his concentration, but Miguel didn't hesitate. The plan was in motion, and he now knew there was no turning back. He wasn't just fighting for his mother. He was fighting for the freedom of his city, for the dignity of the people who, like him, were tired of living in fear. When they entered the barn, Miguel was met by a wall of resistance. The cartel men were ready, but contrary to what they expected, Miguel and Andres were not alone. Other members of the resistance, people whom Miguel had inspired over the past few days, were there to support the cause. They had gathered, without hesitation, with the same determination in their hearts. The fight that Miguel had started was now becoming a collective fight, a fight for an entire community. The battle was intense. The sound of gunfire, screams, and the roar of bombs echoed across the field. Miguel wasn't just fighting the cartel's men. He was confronting the ghosts of his own life, the fears of losing everything he loved, and the fear that his efforts wouldn't be enough. But as he advanced, he felt a transformation within himself. He wasn't just a mechanic fighting to protect his city. He was becoming a leader, someone who knew that by taking that risk, his life would never be the same again. When he finally reached Teresa, the scene was one of pure emotion. She was dirty, tired, and visibly shaken, but still alive. Upon seeing her son, her eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of relief. They were about to escape that hell. "Miguel," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I knew you would come. I knew it." Miguel hugged her tightly, but he didn't have time to lose himself in the moment. The cartel was still hot on his heels, and time was running out. He took her hand and began to guide her toward the exit when a sudden explosion knocked them to the ground. The cartel men had set a final trap. Miguel knew that the only way to guarantee survival was to confront them without hesitation. It was at that moment, while explosions and gunfire echoed around him, that Miguel underwent his great transformation. He was no longer the man who only wanted to protect his mother and his city. He was now someone capable of seeing beyond the violence and destruction. He was the symbol of a silent revolution. His resistance was not based on physical power, but on the strength of his will and the certainty that no matter how much the world tried to break him, he would never surrender. With Teresa's rescue complete, Miguel and his allies emerged victorious. But the true victory wasn't just saving his mother, but showing everyone that the cartel didn't have absolute power. Miguel, now transformed, knew the war wasn't won, but he had taken a crucial step toward changing his city's destiny, and with that, he had freed himself from the chains of fear, becoming the man he was destined to be. Teresa's rescue was only the first step in a journey that Miguel knew couldn't end there. The battle against the Jalisco Cartel was far from over, and he was aware that the real test was yet to come. Miguel and his allies' plan was in full swing, but the cartel was now more alert than ever, and the danger of ruthless retaliation was real. After the rescue, Miguel and Teresa took refuge in a safe place, where they were welcomed by other members of the resistance. The city, once gripped by fear, now pulsed with a new feeling: hope. Miguel had become more than just a target of the cartel. He was the embodiment of a fight for freedom, someone who had dared to defy the powerful. However, Miguel knew he couldn't afford to rest. The fight was far from over, and the cartel, with its tentacles spread throughout the city and the region, wouldn't be brought down so easily. Teresa's kidnapping was merely a strategic move, an attempt to destabilize the resistance. But now, Miguel was stronger, more prepared, and more determined to destroy the cartel once and for all. In a meeting with Andres and the other members of the resistance, Miguel began to outline the next steps. The plan was clear: to further weaken the cartel by attacking its strategic points, dismantling its drug distribution operations, and destabilizing its central leadership. Every action Miguel took was no longer just a matter of revenge or survival. He was building something bigger, a resistance network that could finally confront the oppressive power of the Jalisco Cartel. "Now, more than ever, we need to be strategic," said Miguel, looking at the faces of his allies. The cartel has already underestimated us, but we can't let them realize our next move. We need to act quickly and precisely. If we're going to defeat them, we need to cut off the head of the snake. We're going to attack the distribution centers and trafficking routes they still control. Every blow we land will be a lesson to them that we're no longer running. We're fighting back. Andres nodded with a discreet smile. We're ready. If you want, we can count on more people. The resistance grows every day. But Miguel knew he needed to be cautious. He couldn't risk jeopardizing the resistance movement out of impatience. The city was in turmoil, and the cartel was beginning to reorganize after the blow suffered in Teresa's rescue. The last thing he wanted was to give them a chance to react unprepared. Meanwhile, Javier, increasingly desperate to deal with the growing threat of Miguel, began recruiting more men and intensifying the cartel's presence in the city. He knew that to destroy Miguel, he needed to weaken the resistance before it became an even greater threat. Javier had made a mistake in underestimating Miguel, but now he knew that to defeat him, he would need to destroy everything he loved. I underestimated him, Javier said, looking at El Lobo and other members of his team. Now we're going to make sure Miguel and his friends pay for every move they made. We can't let the resistance grow. We're going to cut off any line of support they have. Tension grew daily. Miguel's every move was being watched, and time was running out. The cartel, aware of the growing threat, intensified its patrols and reinforced its bases, creating increasing pressure on the resistance. But Miguel was determined to keep going. At a crucial moment, as Miguel and his allies prepared to attack one of the cartel's distribution centers, unexpected information reached him. One of his informants had gained access to a cartel strategic plan. Javier was planning a major attack on the city, an all-out offensive to destroy any form of resistance. The decisive moment was approaching, and Miguel knew he needed to act before it was too late. This is our moment, Miguel said after receiving the information. We need to preempt Javier's attack. If we can destroy the cartel's operations center now, before they reorganize, we can weaken them irreparably. But Miguel also knew that the battle would not be easy. He had faced many challenges before, but this offensive would be the riskiest yet. The cartel had more men, more weapons, and above all, more resources. The resistance was growing, but it was still small and poorly equipped. However, Miguel could no longer hesitate. The preparation time was over. It was time for the final confrontation. This is the final step. If we can take down the cartel now, the city will be ours. Freedom will be ours, Miguel declared firmly. We will fight with everything we have, because if we don't, we'll never have a chance to change things. Andres looked at him, his gaze full of determination. We're with you, Miguel. We'll defeat them. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. The final attack was about to happen, and Miguel knew the fight would be bloody and merciless. But he also knew that more than ever, he was ready, not only to save his city, but to ensure that the Jalisco Cartel never again had the power to govern people's lives. The city of Guanajuato was on high alert. The resistance, led by Miguel, had infiltrated the cartel's most strategic points, and the final confrontation was about to happen. Miguel knew that after everything they had faced, there was no room for error. The decisive moment had arrived. It wasn't just a matter of life or death for him and his allies, but a fight for the freedom of the entire city, and perhaps the country. Miguel and Andres were leading the attack on the cartel's operations center, a concrete fortress in the heart of an isolated region. El Lobo and his men were ready, but Miguel had something in mind: surprise. He didn't just want to destroy the cartel. He wanted to make it clear to everyone that resistance wasn't just an idea, but an unbeatable movement. The battle began with a deafening explosion, followed by the sound of gunfire and war cries. Miguel and his allies advanced along the front line, using the terrain to their advantage. They had studied the cartel's every move, and now they were ready to attack them at their weakest points. The cartel, however, was not disorganized. Javier had gathered what remained of his forces, and the cartel's men were prepared to fight to the end. Miguel, with his unwavering determination, led the attack with unexpected skill. He was no longer just the mechanic turned hero. Now he was a war leader. Every step he took, every command he gave to his allies, was part of a deadly dance that demanded precision. He knew his fight wouldn't be merely physical. He was facing the very power of the cartel, a structure with deep roots and immense strength. The sound of gunfire and explosions reverberated off the walls of the operation center. The cartel was using every resource available to repel the attacks. But Miguel and his allies were advancing relentlessly, dismantling the defenses one by one. Each room, each corridor they traversed, was a step closer to destroying the cartel. When Miguel arrived at the control room, where Javier and El Lobo were coordinating their final moves, the shock was immediate. Javier, seeing Miguel enter, showed no fear, only a calculating coldness. He knew that moment was coming, but he still believed he had the power to turn the situation to his advantage. "You think you can defeat us, Miguel?" Javier said with a disdainful smile. "You're just a man against an empire." Miguel stared at him, without immediately answering. The weight of Javier's words echoed in his mind, but he knew the truth was on his side. He was no longer fighting just for his mother, nor for his city. He was fighting for a revolution, a change in power that would overcome the violence of the cartel. "You're right," Miguel said finally, with imperturbable calm. "I'm just a man. But unlike you, I have something that will never break. I have the people. And that's stronger than any empire." At that moment, everything changed. Andres and Miguel's other allies stormed the room, surrounding Javier and El Lobo. The resistance had reached its peak. They were in the heart of the cartel, and the final battle was about to be fought. Seeing his desperate situation, Javier made a quick move, trying to draw a weapon, but Miguel was faster. In a precise and decisive movement, he knocked Javier down and immobilized him on the ground. The Jalisco Cartel, which had been a monster of power and fear, was now crumbling from within. The leadership was destroyed, and the resistance finally had a real chance to win. But El Lobo, ever calculating, was not ready to give up. In a final act of revenge, he tried to throw a grenade at Miguel and his allies, but was stopped by a surprise. Teresa, his mother, who had freed herself during the chaos, had arrived in time to prevent the attack. She, with fierce courage, brought down El Lobo, securing the final victory. Miguel looked at his mother with a smile, his heart pounding. He never imagined that moment would come so quickly, but there he was, facing the very heart of the cartel and overcoming it. The final battle was over, but the impact of his actions would reverberate throughout the city, and who knows, the entire country. "It's over," said Miguel, breathing heavily. "The Jalisco Cartel no longer controls anything." Javier, defeated and imprisoned, looked at Miguel, now with a look of helplessness. "You won. But this is not the end. Power never dies." Miguel didn't answer. He knew that although that battle was over, the war for his city's freedom was only beginning, but he was no longer afraid. He had become something stronger, and his fight had given Guanajuato a real chance to be free. The sky, which had been marked by dark clouds and storms, now opened up to a new dawn. Miguel, Teresa, Andres, and the other allies looked to the horizon with renewed hope. The Jalisco Cartel had been defeated, but the true victory was the freedom that followed. The fight for Guanajuato's freedom was far from over, but the impact of Miguel and his allies' actions was undeniable. The Jalisco Cartel, which had ruled with an iron fist for so long, was crumbling. The resistance, which seemed improbable in the face of the cartel's overwhelming power, now had the opportunity to rebuild the city, restore order, and ensure that the population no longer lived in fear and oppression. Miguel, now breathing more easily, felt a sense of relief, but also an immense responsibility. The weight of his struggle was far from forgotten. He knew that even with the victory over the cartel, there was still much to be done. Guanajuato needed to be rebuilt, and that would require time, effort, and renewed courage. Teresa, beside him, felt the same mix of emotions. His liberation, though painful and difficult, represented the chance for a new life, far from the terror of the cartel. She looked at her son with a gaze full of gratitude and pride, but also with the sadness of someone who knows that, to achieve peace, significant sacrifices had been made. They had won a battle, but the war for true freedom was only beginning. "What you did, Miguel, is more than just for us. You did it for all of Guanajuato, for all of Mexico," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Now, it's time to start again." Miguel looked at her with an expression that mixed exhaustion and determination. "We still have a lot of work ahead of us. We can't let the cartel or anyone else raise their head again. The city needs our unity. We need to heal the wounds, but also ensure that this never happens again." Andres, who was standing beside them, nodded firmly. "We will be with you. The resistance will continue to grow, and we will ensure that the cartel's legacy is buried once and for all." But as Miguel knew, reconstruction wouldn't be easy. The city was still scarred by violence, and the wounds of war would take time to fade. However, there was a new energy in the air. People who had once lived in fear were now rising up, creating a support network not only to fight crime, but to rebuild a society based on justice and freedom. Miguel had started a change, and now he couldn't stop it. As Miguel walked through the streets of Guanajuato, he sensed the transformation happening around him. The same fear that had once paralyzed the city was now being replaced by a collective strength. People were finally beginning to believe that with unity and courage, they could achieve what had previously seemed impossible. However, Miguel knew that the road ahead would not be easy. They had won a crucial battle, but true freedom would only be achieved when all elements of the cartel were eradicated. But he was no longer afraid, not after everything he had lived through, after every sacrifice. He knew that as long as there were people willing to fight, the resistance would never die. "This is just the beginning," he thought, with a resolute smile, watching the sunrise over the city. The future of Guanajuato was in his hands, and he was ready to build it. Months had passed since the fall of the Jalisco Cartel, and the city of Guanajuato was beginning to breathe again. Miguel, now a symbol of resistance and courage, dedicated himself to rebuilding the city, helping to restore order and justice. Teresa, by his side, was one of the community leaders, working tirelessly to ensure that the dark past would not repeat itself. The city was not completely healed, but the change was visible. Although the cartel had been defeated, Miguel knew there was still much to be done. The future was finally in his hands, but vigilance was constant. The fight for freedom never ends. The story of Miguel and the resistance in Guanajuato is just one of many that take place around the world, where ordinary people confront relentless forces in pursuit of freedom and justice. If you felt inspired by this struggle, share this story with others. Let's remember together that true change begins with a simple act of courage and the unity of all those who refuse to accept oppression. May the flame of resistance never be extinguished. Share your thoughts on the story and what you believe we can learn from it. The future depends on each of us.